we have predicated that discussion on the idea of having chloride and sodium selective channels. Let's take the same story, and now rather than putting a barrier in here with ion selective channels, let's think what's going to happen if we put a barrier in here with water selective channels. It's going to be the same idea, but now we're going to be moving water. So let's think about that for a minute. So over here in this panel, this is part of the panel, I want to talk about osmosis as water diffusion. Through aquaporins. Now, an aquaporin is a biological molecule. We're going to see later it's a protein. And it turns out aquaporins are simply water channels. We're going to set up the identical experiment. We have two identical volumes separated by a barrier. Now, in this story, we had sodium and chloride channels, but now what we're going to do is across this barrier, we're going to put water channels. Aquaporins. We're going to do exactly the same arrangement where we have sodium ions and chloride ions in the left-hand chamber. There will be 100 millimoles of sodium ions, 100 millimoles of chloride ions. And over here, we just have water. So there's only water here. And here we have a combination of water and ions. Now, it's true that these are really, really tiny structures. The sodium ions, the chloride ions are really, really little. But they still take up some volume. So what we need to think about here is concentrations. Over here on the right side, we only have water. But here we have a mixture, a solution of sodium and chloride in water. On which side of this barrier is the water concentration greater? The water concentration on the right-hand side is higher than on the left because some of the volume on the left-hand side is being occupied by the sodium and chloride ions, taking up some of the space. So there's simply fewer water molecules on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. So now we have a gradient. We have a gradient such that there's more water here than here. The water molecules are taking, again, their random walk. The random walk we talked about earlier of putting ions into solution. These water molecules are bouncing around. They're bouncing against the wall. But because there are more water molecules on this side than this side, the probability the water molecule is going to bounce against the wall and move from this side to this side is greater than the probability of water molecule going from left to right. So water diffuses from right to left. It's just another illustration how molecules move from regions of higher to lower concentration, but now our focus here is on the water concentration, whereas over here it was on the ion concentration. On the left-hand side, we had no pathways for water to move. So ions move. But here, we have no pathways for ions to move. And we do have pathways for water. So water will move by diffusion. And this process is called osmosis. If you take this to its logical conclusion, if you increase the walls here until they go up well above the roof. And if you increase the height of the barrier, you'll recognize that the constraints we've put on this thought experiment is that water moves right to left. There's no way of moving ions left to right. No matter how much water you put in here, there's always a higher concentration of sodium and chloride on the left side than the right side. So theoretically, water is going to move forever. Turns out that doesn't quite happen. Turns out we do reach an equilibrium in this arrangement. But the equilibrium that we reach is such that there's going to be a downward force because of gravity. There's going to be a downward force called a hydrostatic pressure. This hydrostatic pressure, this mechanical hydrostatic pressure, will come to equilibrium with the forces of osmosis, which are drawing the water right to left. And we will reach an equilibrium. And in fact, this occurs in biology. And I don't know how many of you have had much in the way of plant science, but the way that trees draw water from the soil and up toward the leaves is this simple process of osmosis. That in the roots, there is a salt concentration inside the cells. And the water now moves from the soil into those cells in the roots. And then there is a column of these cells up the tree, and that provides the water vascular system. And the water now moves in at the root and diffuses by osmosis from cell to cell to cell. But there's a limit about how high we can draw that water column. There's a limit, I think it's a couple 100 feet. And yet we know there's some trees that exceed that limit. But if you look at the trees that exceed that limit, such as the redwoods always live in a climate where there's a constant mist of water in the air. And that constant mist of water in the air allows these peculiar trees to actually draw water out of the air through their conifer-like leaves. So they can, in fact, exceed this pressure point where the osmolality of water being drawn into the cells reaches a hydrostatic pressure which balances the osmotic pressure. They can actually get taller than that because they extract the water directly from the air. Now again, I'm not expecting you to understand trees in here, but what I would like you to know is that there is a tremendous force provided by the diffusion, provided by the osmolality of the sodium and chloride drawing water through aquaporins that can in fact push a very high column of water simply by moving ions through this force. Osmolality provides a tremendous force, and we're going to see it over and over again in this course as well. So, any questions to hear? Talked in general about reaching equilibria. Yes? Does hydrostatic pressure only work on water? The answer is no. You can generate a hydrostatic pressure with any fluid. And the advantage of that is that fluids tend to be non-compressible. And I give this analogy, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. If you've ever worked on brakes, you know that you have a brake line. And you know that when you press the pedal, you have a cylinder that pushes out against a fluid, a hydraulic fluid. When that cylinder pushes out against the hydraulic fluid, that fluid moves through your brake lines and moves, in these days, down to calipers, which will then grab onto the disc to provide friction to slow down the car. That's simply done because there's a hydrostatic pressure. There's a hydrostatic pressure that you're using when you force the fluid through the lines from the cylinder. And you get a mechanical advantage because a big cylinder going into a tiny tube, and that fluid then closes the calipers to cause the car to stop. Now, if you've ever worked on brakes, you know you have to bleed the brake lines, because if you have air in the brake lines, the air is compressible. And then you compress the air and you don't close the calipers. That's bad. And so the idea here is that there are hydrostatic pressures that occur in all fluids, but you have to exert a force on that column. When you stop your car, you're exerting a force by pressing on the brakes and activating the main cylinder in your brake cylinder to force that fluid out of the brake lines. People who worked on brakes know this immediately, but people who haven't, kind of, it's a mystery.